Welcome to class. Tonight I'm going to talk about property law or different types of property. I get a kick out of talking about property, and this is module number 5 in your business law materials. And there's quite a bit to read here, and then several discussion board questions. One of them is my favorite discussion board. One of my favorite discussion board questions on everything. It's called Everything is a Remix. And it has to do with the fact that, a lot of information that we get is combined and recombined and recombined. So you have to ask yourself, is anything really new? Should anything really be protected as property? Or are we essentially always sort of recreating things based on people or ideas that have come before us? That's sort of jumping ahead to intellectual property. We're going to talk about it, though. We're going to talk about intellectual property, and then we're also going to talk about real property. We don't so much have to talk about personal property in this class because well, I suppose we do when we spoke about the Uniform Commercial Code and we spoke about goods and contracts for goods. But we'll go into, I'll definitely define it for you so you have a sense of what we're talking about. But anyway, that's what we have going on. Module number 5, all the information on property. But before we do that, I want to provide you with sort of the overview. So property is hugely important to us here in the United States, right? It's pretty foundational to, hit the wrong button, sorry. It's pretty foundational to how a lot of our economy really runs. I mean, you could, our economy is a sort of a capitalist model, right? And I wonder if you could have capitalism without property, or property without capitalism, I suppose. I don't know, maybe I'm getting too deep too fast. But property's huge. The way we think about property, the way we relate to our property. Do we over-relate to our property? Do we have any property? Have we been deprived of property because of different sort of inequities in our world? Has our property been taken away from us? Would we die over our property? There's definitely people who would. So again, a really big topic. So starting with real property. So we get a lot of our property law from the English common law. And the English common law tells us that property is not really a thing necessarily. It is a set of rights that sort of define how you relate to your property. So you have, under the English common law, property being defined by your rights. You might have the right to possess it. You might have the right to use it, to encumber it, which means to borrow money against it, to transfer it, or maybe transfer it and exclude some people from it. And one way to think about this, and in particular, real property, the way to think about real property, by the way, is your homes, the terra firma, the land beneath your feet. One way to think about how you relate to that property is to see these rights as sort of a bundle of sticks. So you've got a bundle of rights that metaphorically relate to this property that you have. So I'm tapping on the ground, I'm tapping on my floor of my house. But so I have the right to possess my house. That's one of the rights that I have. I have the right to use my home. I have the right to encumber my house, at least up into the point of that I actually own it, right? Because I kind of co-own it at this point with the bank. I can transfer my ownership interest, and in transferring it, I could actually exclude some people from benefiting from it. So that's what I mean. So these are the rights that I have as it relates to my property. And, when you, as we think about it in the context of understanding the laws around it, around property, it's helpful to know the history there of the English common law. So today we think of property as a thing. We don't necessarily think of property as a bundle of rights. Property modernly is either real or personal, and I'd also say are intellectual. We are living in a time when intellectual property is very specific, and we'll get to that. Real property consists of land, anything that might be a permanent part of the land, like a tree, or like the home that sits upon the land. That which is incidental or appurtenant to the land, and that which is immovable from the land by law. So land includes soil, rock, other substances that compose the material of the earth. It also includes space, not just the space on the surface of the earth, but the space beneath it to the center of the earth, and the space above it to the top of the sky. The courts have recognized a public right to the use of airspace above private land as a highway available to all, so long as such use does not unreasonably interfere with the landowner's enjoyment of the property. The courts also recognize the fluid and fugitive or moving nature of subsurface oil and gas, the right of the landowner to drill vertically into his or her land for the purpose of capturing these substances is a valuable part of what is included in the ownership of the land. So you might have the right to the gas or oil that lies underneath your land, or the water or the mineral substances that lie under your land, or you may not. I know I don't have that right. The manner in which land is transferred here in Orange County usually excludes that right to those substances. So what do I mean things affixed to land? That can include buildings, bridges, trees, as well as anything that is affixed to them. The doors of a building, permanently installed cabinets, or built-in appliances. When I say incidental or pertinent to the land, what I mean is anything which is by right used with the land for its benefit. So water courses, easements, rights of way, and those things. And then sometimes crops. A tenant's crops, industrial or growing crops, and things attached to or forming part of the land, which are agreed to be severed before sale or under the contract, are treated as goods. So a crop is a good, although for a bit of time, it's kind of like a tree, and it's actually part of the land. Crops gives you into sort of a gray area. So we know what real property is now. Crops and some other things kind of form this gray area, that distance between real property and personal property. Personal property is anything that is not real property, right? So all these pens that I picked up, my glasses, my stapler, my bank accounts, all of that is personal property, and crops, apparently. So I mentioned the vastness of property law. And in fact, you can see property law as it spreads from the very tippy top of where we get our laws from, right? The very tippy top of, or the bottom, as I've got it in my diagram here, but the US Constitution, right, mentions land. We have this thing called eminent domain mentioned in the Constitution, and we'll talk about it. And we also talk about land in the context of the 14th Amendment with regard to equal protection. There are definitely federal laws that relate to property or real estate law. Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, Real Estate Settlement Procedures Acts, different environmental laws, right? And then around all these statutory laws, you also have court decisions that are impacting how those laws are interpreted. And so now take it to the state, right? So you have different state environmental laws. You have you have laws about employment and housing. You have information about real estate sales. More locally, and especially very contentiously, you have sort of land use rules that come at you sometimes from the state, but sometimes also very locally. And it's interesting to me too, how nasty local politics can get over land use. Does anybody know what NIMBY means? NIMBYism? What is NIMBYism? It stands for not in my backyard, meaning, no matter how well-intentioned law may be, maybe we want more diversity in our neighborhoods, right? More lower income housing in a neighborhood. There's a sense of NIMBYism, right? I may agree with that, but I don't necessarily want it in my backyard. And just for the record, I disagree. I'm happy to have it in my backyard. In fact, I actually kind of do, but a story for another time. But anyway, so the sources of laws that affect our property go all the way down from the Constitution to something we call private law. Private law is the law of contracts. And we talked about contracts a couple of weeks ago, but when you buy and sell a home, right, that's private law. That's a contractual agreement between you and someone else to purchase something. Okay, so back to my bundle of sticks that relates to property. So there are different types of estates, right? There are different types of ways that you can relate to your bundle of your rights, or you can relate to your land. There's this thing called fee simple. And to have a fee simple relationship with your land means you pretty much own it outright. Not only do you own the land, or or in the process of owning it, maybe the bank's involved a little bit, but with a fee simple ownership structure, you can sell it, but most importantly, under the law, you can actually bequeath your interest, meaning you can pass down your interest. So let's say Norma's my daughter, and I have a fee simple interest in my home. I can pass that on to Norma when I die. It can be in my will. That right, those inheritance rights are part of this fee simple arrangement. There's another way that you can relate to your property, and we call that a life estate. And a life estate is almost like fee simple, except that when you die, you can't pass it on, right? Your right to that property only exists while you are alive, and while and I tend to think of this as grandpa's girlfriend, right? That's what always crosses my mind whenever I think of a life estate. It's grandpa and grandma bought a house and they paid and raised their kids and did all the things that you do in that house, built a family. And then grandma died, right? And grandpa's left alone. And so what does grandpa do? He finds himself a girlfriend real quick. And then now all of a sudden you've got kind of, and the kids are never all that happy because they loved mom, right? But grandpa said, new girlfriend says, ooh, I'm going to move in there with you, but what'll happen when you pass on? I won't have my place anymore. And grandpa says, it's okay, you can live here while you're, for the rest of your life, right? She by virtue of that, presuming it's legal, they put it into writing. That's what a life estate is. So the kids are kind of pissed because now they got to wait for now they got to wait for girlfriend to pass on before they actually inherit the house, things like that. And it happens. There's also this thing called estate for years. That's a lease. How many people lease an apartment or lease their home right now? Right? Those are rental agreements. And you can have a rental agreement for a certain amount of time, or you can have one that's at will, meaning sometimes I think it probably approximates to month to month, right? Whoever rents month to month. So those are different ways that you might own your property, or you might have a way to relate to your property. Okay, so not only do you relate to your property in some way, but you relate in a point in time, right? There's past self, present self, future self. That might be one way of understanding. A present interest is when you are entitled to enter the property and make use of the property right now. I have a present interest in occupying my home right now because I have the mortgage, I have the ownership, it's mine right now. A future interest may be an interest that I come into down the line. So at this point, I have a future interest in my mom's home. My mom is older. I'm her only surviving child. She owns a home. And the home has been left to me, right? I have a future interest in that home. It actually may not come to fruition, right? She may be able to change her will or something else. Future interests aren't always certain, but the law calls some of these future interests remainders, reverters, or rights of entry. Your landlord has a future interest in in the property that you are staying at. Was it Lynn that raised her hand? Whereas you have a present interest. As long as you are current in your rent, your present interest to occupy that property. Non-possessory land interests. So remember I was talking about the mineral deposits underneath my house, or the gas deposits underneath that house. If I actually owned them, I could license them. I could license access to those minerals to a company, and they would have a contractual right or a license to extract that valuable thing from the property. So they can't possess the property, but they have license to come onto the property for the purpose of extracting something. A lot of times, a better example of that is a lot of times if you own like forest land, you might license to a timber company the right to come in and harvest some of your trees, right? And then potential interest. So my bank has a potential interest in my house because I'm only halfway done with paying for it. I'm only halfway through my mortgage. So if I were to stop paying, their potential interest would become an actual interest, right? And they would be able to move forward on that. So that's, again, another way of relating to this bundle of rights that you have in your property. Okay. And so up to this point, I've been saying you, me, me. Now I'm going to say us. Because I don't know that I've ever owned a piece of property, real property, by myself. In fact, I haven't. I've always owned it in conjunction with my husband, right? So I have always owned something concurrently with this other person. And the type of concurrent ownership that we have is community property. Community property is joint ownership of property by husband and wife, I should say by spouses, in which each spouse owns an undivided 1/2 interest in the property acquired during marriage. Sometimes it's called a tenancy in the entirety. Joint ownership of property means that one party cannot transfer an interest in the property without the other spouse's consent. I'm changing my little notes here. Another type, so if I wanted to buy property with someone I wasn't married to, but I wanted a lot of the same rights, I would probably look at joint tenancy. Joint tenancy is a joint ownership of property in which each co-owner owns an undivided interest in the whole property. The interesting thing about joint tenancy is that there's a right of survivorship, meaning that if somebody were to pass, just like in community property, the other person would have a right to the entire property. We call that joint tenancy. What if you wanted to own property with somebody else, but you didn't have that sort of marital or partnership relationship with them? You wanted to own a share of the property. We call that tenancy in common. So myself and Maria, we want to go buy a home, but if something happens to either one of us, I don't want my interest to go to Maria and she doesn't want her interest to go to me. We both want our interests to pass to our children. We would probably seek out a tenancy in common because, again, there's no right of survivorship. I already spoke, or it was already mentioned, the extent of a real estate interest. So think the things above and the things below. Although that's probably been modified by a lot of statutory law and actual deeds these days. But I also want you to think about that in the context of, do you have a right to the sunlight, right? Let's say you own a home and somebody comes and builds a skyscraper right next door to you. Have they infringed upon one of your property rights, right? One of the ways that you relate to your property. What if you have a pool? What if you have solar? What if you live near the beach, right? That sunlight is certainly important to the homeowner in that context. So to what extent does your right extend? Jan, did you have something you wanted to add? So you're also going to think about wind, you're going to think about views. So you spent $4 million on a Newport Beach property because you want to be able to see the ocean, and some jerk comes and buys the property in front of you and puts up palm trees, right? There's actually a lot of those cases. and some rich guy will get us go out and saw down the trees, right? Views, mineral gas reserves, energy, so geothermal energy, water rights, licenses and trespassing, and sort of nuisance issues all come to bear upon, hey, what is the actual extent of my real estate interest in my home? So like I said, I don't think I own the minerals or anything below my property. And I don't think I own, it's sort of recognized that planes can fly over. But I do have solar, and I remember contemplating my neighbor's trees when I got the solar. And it was interesting because I remember the solar guy said, you know, you can actually, we have some money we can allocate towards trimming those trees as part of this agreement. No, I didn't end up taking that agreement, but nonetheless. So what is an easement? An easement is a non-possessory interest in a piece of real estate. It's a right to use another's property in a manner established by an express or an implied agreement. So where I live, it's actually kind of horse property, kind of old-fashioned-y. And we actually own the street, my neighbors and I, and there's probably about 8 people on the street. And I don't mean to make it sound posh, because it's not. It's just in an older part of the city where I live. But anyway, we own the street, which requires that in all of our deeds, we also give each other a right to pass over our home, right? Pass over the street to access the whoever's house it is. There are also, most of our houses have utilities easements now, right? So we give an easement to the gas company, to the electric company, the water company, right? To pass over our property in some manner. That's what an easement is. It's the right to use the property of another. And the stuff about dominant, servient doesn't really matter for this class. Okay, so what might be important to this class is that if somebody owns property and that person owes you money, or vice versa, a lien can be placed on the property, meaning the lien holder has a priority in getting compensated when the home is sold, right? A lien is a claim against a debtor's property that must be satisfied before other creditors may claim the property or its proceeds. And you may have heard of these in the context of like a mechanic's lien or an artist's lien. Someone doing work to your house and you don't pay them for that work can go down and actually file a lien, which, you know, and they actually would have to take you to small claims court first and get the judgment, and then the judgment can be placed against the property. And there's actually all sorts of types of ways that you can attach someone's property to satisfy a judgment. And we're going to go into a couple of those right now, because they do apply to business. A writ of attainment is a court order to seize and take into custody property of the debtor prior to the issuance of a judicial lien. A writ of execution is a court order following the issue of a judicial lien to seize or sell property of the debtor. And then garnishment is the one we tend to know the most about. It's the legal process used by a creditor to seize property belonging to the debtor. So my HR person probably knows what garnishment is, because HR professionals are all the time getting notified of a garnishment, which means that, okay, $400 a month is coming out of Professor Smith's paycheck because Citibank has a judgment against her, or she has children and it's going towards child support, something like that. But those are different types of liens and garnishments. Ultimately, they're different ways to take property from you or me using the judicial process. And there are limitations, right? There are limitations to how much of your property can be taken from you, right? Can so much property be taken from you that you don't have a place to live, or you can't feed yourself or your family? And for the most part, the answer is no. So know that if the most common scenario, that if your wages are ever garnished, usually I think it's 10 days. Usually a person has 10 days to reply to the garnishment order with some there's a process whereby, you know, you present a budget and say, I need this much to live. This is how much I can afford to pay towards this. Or you can consider bankruptcy, and bankruptcy would likely eliminate a lot of those debts, but not child support or not education debt or things like that. So how do we describe our interest in real property? So whenever you fill out a probate document or your will or statute of frauds, they'll require a written description of land that identifies the land other than just using the address, right? You can't just say 1234 Main Street. You need to be able to describe the interest. Difficulties have come up over time with sometimes describing people's interest in real property. And as a result, you know, whenever you buy or sell a home, for instance, you will actually go and search title and kind of try to weed out any of those problems. But how do you describe an interest in property? There's different systems. There's a system that's based on surveys, right, where someone comes out and actually measures meets and bounds, right? So the property meets Main Street and is bound by 2nd Street. And then a lot of property in Orange County, there are tract maps, right? So you can see how much property is part of a home. And whatever the method, though, property is recorded, or deeds, right? We call that instrument that describes property, we call it a deed, and that gives public notice of ownership, and if filed, any of those encumbrances that we talked about earlier, encumbrances like liens or whatnot. And so that's how we describe our interests in property. So when you want to sell a property, that's done by contract, right? And real estate contracts have been litigated and litigated and litigated over the years to such an extent that there's a standard real estate contract that the state association usually provides people who are realtors. Do I have anybody here who's a licensed realtor? But anyway, a real estate contract is governed by a lot of case law and a fair amount of statutory law. And that's really a lot of what real estate agents do, sort of manage that contract and all the disclosures and the people that have to come in and out in order to put into effect a real estate transaction. So here are some sample clauses that go within a real estate contract. So usually what happens in the course of a real estate contract is that a prospective buyer will make a written offer and deposit some amount of earnest money with an escrow agent. That earnest money gets applied towards the contract. Contracts for the sale of real estate are covered under what's called the statute of frauds, and we talked about that when we talked about contracts, which means that they need to be in writing, and it should include at a minimum the purchase price, the type of deed that someone will receive, any contingencies such as, okay, I'll buy this house as long as I can get a loan, right? That's a contingency. My offer to buy is contingent on me qualifying for a loan, and a legal description of the property and the closing date and time. So that's what those are the parts of a sales contract. You also typically with your real estate agent will have a listing agreement. That is, if you are the seller, you in essence are hiring this person to do this thing to sell your house. And that's another contract that you have in the course, but it's not, it doesn't involve your deed or any actual property rights. I want to mention to you what eminent domain is. Eminent domain is a sovereign government's appropriation of private property for public use, and payment is made, right? It needs to be just compensation. Eminent domain, a lot of times depends on how powerful the actors are in that transaction. There's a horrible history in the United States of eminent domain being used to route freeways and highways through poor and minority neighborhoods, right? It's not uncommon, the more wealthy you are, the less at risk for eminent domain you actually are. So that should be recognized as well. Is there any space in here for me to tear? And I would say, generally speaking, the intersection of civil rights and property is huge. There's billboards everywhere. There's people holding up their signs, all that kind of good stuff. And Jan, if you have something you want to comment, I see you kind of going on and off. Definitely feel free. But you know, there's really good video or good information available on things like redlining, right? Which really relates back to the federal government's backing of mortgages for certain buyers in certain areas. So actually the federal government being engaged and saying, you as an African-American person, you live in this neighborhood, you as a white person, you live in this neighborhood, and seeing the value of the neighborhoods rise and fall with some correspondence to that. Also seeing the predatory lending of money, mortgage money, to individuals who, you know, can't necessarily afford to remain in the home, and those unoccupied homes becoming less and less valuable because, you know, homes need people in them. Someone's got to get out and mow the yard, make sure the pipes don't freeze over, things like that. then you start to think about home ownership actually influences other things in our neighborhoods, like, you know, grocery stores, how many grocery stores we get, the type of schools that our children go to, and how much school, although less so now, has historically been funded through property taxes, which are derived, you know, right from the neighborhood you live in, right? So the amount spent on the school would correspond to the property values within that it was serving, which, you know, which leads a lot of times to segregated neighborhoods. So there's a real history of that, and a very intentional history, a very systematic history. It's not accidental. It's not, you know, people just like to live near people that they can relate to. It's much more systematic than that, for sure. That's why, too, you know, one of the reasons I think property is such a huge issue in our lives. So another good resource that I want to key you into is called California Tenants Guide to Landlord Rights and Responsibilities. You can just Google this, California Landlord Tenant Rights, and it's a good little book that the state Department of Housing, maybe it is, but puts out. Maybe it's consumer protection, but it talks about your rights as it relates to a landlord. So I think it's important bit of information to sort of ground yourself in. Oh, I already did this one a little bit. So speaking of landlords, understand that just the same way that there are types of ways that you relate to your property as a owner, there are also ways that you relate to your property as you hold a lease. And I know I mentioned this, so you can have a lease for a state for years. You can have one from a certain period to a certain period, and you can have a estate at will, which is month to month, or you can have what's called an estate at sufferance, which means you've overstayed your welcome. And the landlord is sort of suffering your presence until they can go to court and evict you. When you think about leases in a business context, a lot of times people will also think about fixtures. And so you remember how I spoke about crops as it relates to your property? Well, fixtures are like crops to leases. So when you lease a home and you put in a ceiling fan, do you have the right to take that ceiling fan out when you leave? You may argue that you do. Your landlord may argue that you don't. Probably more significant, let's say you rent business property, and let's say you're going to have a t-shirt business, and you get all that equipment to do the silk screening on the t-shirts and everything. And because you care about your worker safety, you know, it's all OSHA compliant, everything's drilled into the floor, right? So the big equipment can't move, and so forth. So when you leave that business, well, that equipment has been attached to the floor. You obviously want to be able to unattach it and take it to your next warehouse, right? So there's lots of law around fixtures and leases, right? What you can add to property and what you can't add to property. Or if you've in effect donated it. This also makes me think of like garbage disposals and things like that you do to your apartment. I lived in the crappiest apartment when I was in college, but I only paid $225 a month to live there. I had a roommate, and that roommate paid another $225. So our total rent, can you believe it, was $450 a month to live. And it was nice crappy. It was like, it was crappy because the landlord didn't want to do anything to it. But as long as we shut up and kept everything clean, he never asked for more rent. It was, stayed that way. But yeah, it was the making of me, right? Gosh, to have good rent, it can be the making of you, because it allows you to do things like go to school and start your family. I really, really, really think housing should be more affordable. It's a sin that it isn't. But I digress. Yeah, I do this I teach a class called Business Transactions, right, where we talk about contract law with paralegals and whatnot. And I do this whole thing on how important it is to get yourself a piece of property to live in, because it's the only way that as the cost of living goes up, you sort of, as you get older, especially, you're able to maintain. And I guess it's not the only way, you could also put money aside in the stock market or something like that, or in a savings account. But yeah, I'm a big believer in being able to purchase your home. But that does not appear to be high on people's priority list. And by people, I mean politicians and things like that. Okay, so the California statute of frauds requires a lease of longer than a year to be in writing. So I just had a former student tell me that they're planning into moving in an apartment. And I said, oh, is it a lease, or are you renting it month to month? And they said, oh, it's a lease. I said, oh, then it's in writing. It's going to be more than a year. And she said, well, it's not in writing. I said, well, then it's month to month. Right? Because the statute of frauds, which means that if you live there after 3 months and it's not to your liking, you can say to the landlord, okay, let me give you 30 days. I'm going to go ahead and move out. Because again, it's not in writing. So commercial leases are big, extravagant, heavily negotiated types of contract. You hear of people sometimes going into commercial real estate, right? Selling big buildings or selling space within a building, or renting, excuse me, I'm talking about leasing. Very focused on negotiating and on contract language and understanding contracts. So up to now, I've been talking about real property, again, homes, land, dirt, that kind of stuff. I also mentioned personal property being pens and everything else that's not real property, literally everything else around you. But I also want to spend some time on intellectual property, because intellectual property can be really important in a business context. But you know what? I think I'm going to divide this into 2 different lectures. Yeah, because I know going over property like we just did is a lot to put in your brain. And I know we have at least 5 more meetings, so I can spread this out and talk to you next week about intellectual property. So I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. Are there anything any questions that I can answer for you about real property or personal property?
Professor, I had a question.
Yeah.
I was just curious because I remember watching a documentary or like some movie about squatters.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about squatters? Because I know it's like it was complicated. It seemed complicated for the person that owned the home to like get them out. that or not?
Yeah, and I don't know that that's so much a property issue as a just a practical issue, right? But you know, that's something that happens when neighborhoods fall into disrepair, right? That's bad policy making by our lawmakers. Squatters, it's sort of, they're actually not tenants, right? So I used to have people call in at legal aid and they would say, well, I'm living with my grandma and she wants me to go. What rights do I have? And I said, well, do you pay grandma rent? Well, no. I said, well, you're not a tenant. You really don't have any rights. You're over the age of 18. Grandma can ask you to leave the home, right? If somebody's not paying for the use, the possession of the whatever it is, the room or whatnot, they're not officially a tenant, which means they don't have rights as it in relationship to the property. That doesn't mean they can't be a pain in the ass, right? Somebody gets access to your house. You know, there can be all sorts of complicated issues, like proving that they shouldn't be there and that you should. Maybe you have to hire a lawyer. And then it also makes me think there's this really kind of funny area of law. It's called adverse possession. Another thing to think about when you think of law as it relates to property is there's actually this thing called best use. So what is the best use of property? And you can relate that to adverse possession sometimes. When somebody openly uses your property, after a time, and it's usually a period of years, right? And doing it openly and in front of everybody, making better use of the property than you do. Sometimes they have what's called a claim of adverse possession, meaning that as a policy matter, they have acquired possession of your property, but that wouldn't necessarily tie into what rights a squatter might have, which I've never researched that. I don't necessarily know. But you also mentioned watching something on it. There's a really good YouTube video. Anybody ever watched that that show? It's called Adam Ruins Everything. He does a really good one on redlining. So if you got 15 minutes, watch Adam Ruins Everything on redlining. And then on a more sophisticated level, there's a really good book by I think she teaches at Yale, Keeanga Yamita Taylor, but she wrote this book and it's called A Race for Profit, and it describes how banks and the real estate industry undermined Black homeownership. And again, this is a topic that we talk about in my transactions class, less in this business law class. But I think it's an important topic. It's worth a little time to research. But you can also Google race for profit, and I've seen one or two events where she's gone and spoke as an author. Can you see that? Race for profit. Anyway, huge, like I said, huge issue. Property. Any other questions or thoughts or comments or disagreement? Do you disagree with me on anything? I'd be happy to entertain that as well. But if not, I'm done with you. So if you're done with me, you can go ahead and move on. I'm not in any hurry though.